Joao always woke up at the same time, with the precision of a Swiss watch. Strong black coffee was his fuel, and a starched shirt was his battle uniform. The day began with the serenity of someone who already knew his own steps. Leaving the house, catching the crowded bus, and walking to the door of the luxury store where he worked as a security guard. He liked this routine. Predictability gave him security, and he believed that order was what kept society functioning. The mall where he worked was not just a place to shop, but a symbol of what people aspired to be. Designer clothes, imported perfumes, jewelry that sparkled under the bright lights. The store that Joao supervised, which specialized in luxury goods, was the heart of this world. His customers were the elite who believed that wealth was the only parameter of value. And Joao, with his watchful eye and impersonal demeanor, ensured that. His job was simple, to make sure that no one crossed the line. There was no room for error, and he took pride in that. He had a code, a clear line between right and wrong. He believed that people without means had no business being in this environment. The store was a haven for the well-to-do, not a place for those who couldn't afford it. It was a matter of order and discipline. People who seemed out of place needed to be dealt with a firm hand. It was on a gray morning, when the movement was still quiet, that Hugo walked through the door of the store. The beggar had messy hair, dirty clothes, and a tired expression that reflected a life of hardship. Joao noticed him immediately, his safety instinct activated. He knew he shouldn't let that kind of person get close. Hugo looked around, perhaps looking for something to eat, or perhaps just a little warmth. But Joao had no doubts about his mission. With firm steps, he approached and, with an authority that seemed natural in his posture, said, "This is not the place for you. Go away before I call security." The beggar, apparently resigned, did not argue. He simply looked at John with a mixture of sadness and tiredness, and, without words, took a step back. John watched with a judgmental look, but felt no remorse. For him, he was doing the right thing. He was a protector of the order and the image of that place. The beggar disappeared into the crowd of the mall, but John's attitude seemed to reinforce his view of the world. He was in control, and the chaos outside the store doors should not be allowed in. But as the rest of the day went on with its usual monotony, John couldn't help but feel a strange sensation that something wasn't quite right. The beggar's almost lifeless gaze kept echoing in his mind, like a small shadow he couldn't shake. In the days that followed, the scene in the store seemed to have faded from John's memory, but something subtle still remained. Hugo, the beggar, had not returned, and John continued his routine with the same degree of discipline and focus. The mall was full of shoppers, but something was different. He felt, without quite understanding, a restlessness inside him. He tried to push away the thought of the beggar, reminding himself that he had done the right thing. Order had to be maintained, and that was all that mattered. That was when the scene repeated itself, but in an even more disconcerting way. On a sultry morning, Hugo reappeared, almost as if he were a shadow of his former self. He entered the store again, wearing the same dirty clothes and with an even more defeated posture. His gaze, however, was different. It was as if, this time, he had something more, something beyond the appearance of a man that life had left behind. Joao watched, and this time, he couldn't help but shiver slightly. Before Hugo had time to take another step into the store, Joao was already approaching, like a relentless machine. His voice was firm and without hesitation, as it always was when he needed to act. "I warned you. You are not allowed to stay here." The beggar, once again, did not react with hostility. But there was something in his silence that bothered Joao. It was a silent resignation that contained pain. He did not try to escape, did not try to speak. He simply accepted the humiliation without a look of defiance. But something was wrong. Joao's discomfort deepened, and the regret for Hugo's situation began to beat in his mind, like a distant echo. With an authoritative gesture, Joao led him to the exit, pushing him out of the store. The humiliation was public and clear, and the beggar left without a word. But as Hugo walked away, Joao found himself looking back at the store, feeling a growing discomfort. He knew that he was not only pushing the man away from the mall, but also, in some way, pushing something away inside himself. That night, when John returned home, the scene seemed to replay in his mind, like a movie he couldn't stop watching. He knew he had done what needed to be done. The beggar shouldn't have been there. But why couldn't he shake the feeling that he had been wrong? The image of Hugo leaving, defeated, flashed through his mind over and over again. His own thoughts bothered him. Perhaps what disturbed him was the idea that the beggar wasn't so different from him. They were both trying to survive, each in their own way. However, while he hid behind rules and codes, Hugo seemed to be a representation of what he feared most: the loss of control, the loss of power. John knew that deep down he hadn't just thrown someone out of the store, but perhaps he was somehow throwing something deeper out of himself. The night passed, but Joao's restlessness persisted. He constantly questioned whether he had done the right thing. What was the point of being a man of principles if he couldn't distinguish between what was right and what was human? He had never had to deal with this dilemma before. At work, everything always seemed simple and clear. But with Hugo, he couldn't understand why everything was so hazy. The weekend arrived and, as usual, Joao took his morning walk to the mall. His uniform was impeccable, but his spirit seemed heavier than usual. Even though he tried to concentrate on his work, something distracted him. He couldn't get the image of Hugo out of his head, that nameless beggar, with no history, just a shadow wandering around a place that didn't belong to him. The uncomfortable feeling continued to grow inside him, as if he were being watched by something he couldn't see. As he entered the mall, the chaos of weekend shopping filled the air. People seemed so absorbed in their consumer needs that they barely noticed others. Joao positioned himself at the entrance to the luxury store, as always, watching and controlling every movement. But something was different that morning. He didn't know what exactly, but he felt that the usual calm had been broken. And then he saw him. Hugo stood at the entrance to the mall, wearing the same dirty clothes, but now something was more visible in his eyes. It was a distant, almost empty look. It wasn't just the lack of resources that marked him. Something else seemed to have hit him, as if life had emptied him, left him without strength. Joao felt his heart tighten for a moment. But the protocol, the code he followed every day, was clear. He knew what he had to do. Joao approached Hugo with firm steps, his mind already full of harsh words, ready to expel him once again. But, when he was a few meters away, a familiar voice called him. Joao turned quickly, recognizing the figure that had emerged from the hallway. It was his mother, Dona Lucia, a simple woman, with a gentle and always warm energy, who knew him better than anyone else. She walked up to him with a shy smile, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she knew exactly what was going on in his mind. She placed her hand on his arm and said calmly, "John, what are you doing here? Don't tell me you're going to do what you did last time." Joao hesitated. His mother's words were not just a request. They carried a tone of silent judgment, something he didn't know how to respond to. He looked at Hugo, and the beggar was staring at him with a frightening calm, as if he had understood something that Joao couldn't. Joao didn't know how to explain to her what he was feeling. The need to maintain order, to protect that luxurious environment, and to keep the strangers away seemed to be part of his essence. But his mother looked at him with a gentleness that he couldn't understand at that moment. "Mom, you don't understand. He doesn't belong here." Joao spoke with a choked voice, unable to hide the anger in his words. Dona Lucia sighed deeply, looking at her son with a mixture of concern and sadness. She knew that he had become someone rigidly attached to his beliefs and to a code that, many times, seemed more like a shield than a true defense of justice. "John, you are looking at him, but you are not seeing. Look inside, son. What you see in him is what you are afraid of being. But no one is less worthy of a place in this world, no matter how hard life has been on them." Joao felt a chill run through his body. His mother's words resonated with a raw truth that he didn't know how to deal with. He looked at Hugo, who now seemed more human, more real. It wasn't just the beggar he wanted to push away. It was something inside him that he feared, something he didn't want to face. His identity, his beliefs, everything was being questioned in that moment. But before he could say anything, his mother gently pulled him aside. With a silent look, she indicated that he should look beyond the surface. And for the first time, John looked at the man in front of him with a new perspective. Hugo, the beggar, was no longer just in his mind as a distant and disposable figure. He was a reflection of something bigger, something that Joao needed to understand in order to free himself. In the days that followed, Joao couldn't get Hugo out of his mind. The conversation with his mother echoed in his thoughts with every step he took. What she had said made sense, but he felt lost, as if he were being pulled into an unknown place. Hugo wasn't just a beggar. He represented something deeper, something that Joao tried to ignore within himself. Every time he closed his eyes, he remembered Hugo's gaze, empty, but with an intensity that seemed to defy Joao's reality. What did he see in that expression? What did he fear to the point of reacting with such contempt? It was on a particularly cold morning that the situation took an unexpected turn. John was sitting at his desk in the office, reviewing reports and trying to keep himself busy. The usual routine, full of orders and controls, but without the same satisfaction as before. Something inside him had changed, even if he didn't know what it was yet. The phone rang, and the mall manager's voice interrupted his thoughts. "John, we need you here. There's something going on that could get out of control." Hugo showed up again. "He's over there in the food court. It seems like he's asking for help, but there's something strange. We don't know what he wants, but there's a big crowd around him. Go over there." With his heart racing, Joao grabbed his things and hurried out, his mind filled with anxiety. What would Hugo do now? Why had he chosen this moment to come back? He knew he had to take control of the situation, as he always did. However, as he walked towards the food area, something told him that this time would be different. When he arrived, the scene was even more surreal than he had imagined. Hugo was in the center of a large circle of people. He wasn't begging or causing a commotion. Instead, he was speaking. His voice was low, but filled with a serenity that contrasted with the bustling environment around him. The people were curious, but also apprehensive. Joao, standing at a distance, began to feel a lump in his throat. He moved closer, disguising the anxiety that was growing in his chest. Hugo, with his deep and calm gaze, spoke about his life. He did not tell sad stories of abandonment or rejection, but of a reality that many preferred to ignore. He spoke about the mistakes he had made, about the opportunities he had missed, but also about the lessons he had learned along the way. His tone was almost philosophical, as if he knew something that others had not yet discovered. Listening to his words, Joao felt uncomfortable, as if he were being challenged to look at a part of himself that he had buried long ago. At one point, Hugo looked directly at Joao, his deep eyes piercing him as if he knew what he was thinking. It was as if he knew the fear that Joao carried within him. That challenging look was not an attack, but a kind of invitation for an internal confrontation. Joao paused for a moment, observing the man he had despised, the man he had humiliated days before. Hugo was no longer the faceless beggar. He was a presence, something that could not be ignored. The crowd around him seemed to be waiting for Joao to take action, but what was he to do? He knew he had the power to push him away, as he had always done. But in that moment, he felt powerless. What he was seeing was a reflection of his own fears, a distorted version of himself, and he didn't know how to deal with it. Finally, after a few seconds that seemed endless, Hugo spoke again, this time directly to Joao, without looking at the others around him. "It's not about where you are. It's about what you do with what you have. What do you have to offer? What do you have to learn from me?" The words were etched in Joao's mind, and he felt a wave of shame and reflection take over his body. He had always believed he was in control, that life was about following rules, following orders. But there, in front of that man, he realized there was more at stake than he imagined. Maybe he was moving away from something essential, something he needed to understand in order to grow. The crowd began to slowly disperse, and Hugo, unhurriedly, began walking towards the exit. Joao watched him leave, not knowing what to do, not knowing what to say. He was silent, not because he didn't have any answers, but because he had never allowed himself to ask the right questions. That night, Joao could barely sleep. His mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts pulling him in different directions. He tried to understand the meaning of Hugo's words, tried to rationalize what had happened at the mall, but nothing seemed to make sense. Hugo, the man he had despised so many times, had now planted a seed inside him, something that could not be ignored. The feeling of discomfort would not leave him. He felt as if he were on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into an abyss of self-knowledge that he was not prepared to face. The next day, Joao woke up earlier than usual, as if his body felt the urgency to seek an answer. He went for his walk, but he didn't go to the mall. Instead, he went to the park where he and his mother used to walk when he was younger. The fresh morning air calmed him a little, but the questions were still there. What was he looking for? What did he really want? He thought about Hugo, about his deep, calm gaze. Something about that man, at that moment, touched him in a way he couldn't understand. Why couldn't he, Joao, have that peace, that acceptance? As he walked through the park, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from his mother. She knew something was happening to him. She had always known. Her words, simple and direct, sounded like a call. "John, son, don't ignore what you're feeling. You're not just a police officer. You're someone who has the ability to look inside yourself and change. Don't be afraid of that." His mother's words hit him with the force of a punch to the gut. He paused for a moment, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. What he feared was not the confrontation with Hugo, but the confrontation with himself. He feared what he might discover about his own life, his choices, and what he had become. All he had ever known was control, rigidity, the idea of being someone immune to suffering. But what if he was wrong? Joao sat on a park bench and looked at the trees around him, feeling the gentle breeze on his face. He closed his eyes, trying to calm himself, but his mind continued to run in circles. He knew he couldn't ignore the pain he felt, the feeling that something inside him needed to be healed. He needed to face himself, to look head-on at his insecurities, his fears, his flaws. It wasn't just about Hugo. It was about everything he had always avoided seeing in himself. When John opened his eyes, something inside him had changed. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would, but there was a new feeling in his heart. He couldn't control everything, and maybe that was the point. Maybe that was true power. The ability to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to allow yourself to learn and grow, to face what was inside you without fear. The sight of Hugo no longer seemed like a threat to him. Hugo was just a reflection, a mirror that showed what Joao was avoiding. He no longer needed to push him away, but rather to understand what that encounter had taught him. Perhaps it was the hardest lesson of all. True change starts from the inside out. The decision was made. John knew he had to do things differently. He had to look beyond the surface and confront his own prejudices, not only about others, but also about himself. He stood up from the bench, and for the first time, felt ready to take the next step. He didn't know where it would lead, but he was ready to move forward, with a more open heart and a freer mind.